December 1944. Somewhere near the German border, the air hangs thick with smoke and the distant crack of rifle fire. The snow is fresh, white, innocent, but beneath it lies death. Hundreds of anti-tank mines scattered like seeds of steel across a narrow, frozen valley. A U.S. infantry squad huddles behind a shattered stone wall. Their medic kneels over a bleeding man. Shrapnel through the leg. Artery cut. The field hospital is less than a mile away, but between them stretches the minefield. Silent, invisible, merciless. Then, a sound. A low growl of an engine. From the tree line, a single Willys Jeep rolls forward. Its olive paint dusted with frost, its headlights dimmed with mud. Behind the wheel, a young corporal grips the steering wheel so tight his knuckles turn white. His commanding officer shouts, "Stop! That's suicide!" But the Jeep keeps moving. The soldiers hold their breath as the vehicle inches forward, tires crunching over snow, every rotation a coin flip between life and death. On the ridge opposite, German observers lift their binoculars. They can believe what they re-seeing. One American Jeep driving straight into a minefield. By late 1944, the war in Europe had reached a fevered stalemate. After the Allied landings in Normandy 6 months earlier, the armies of the United States, Britain, and Canada had smashed through France, liberated Paris, and driven the Germans eastward. But as autumn gave way to the freezing winter, their rapid advance met a wall. The Siegfried Line, or West Wall, Germany's last line of defense. Stretching more than 390 miles, the Siegfried Line was no ordinary fortification. It was a labyrinth of dragon's teeth, pillboxes, anti-tank ditches, and minefields buried beneath the soil. Every road, every field, every riverbank had been laced with explosives and traps. For the weary men of the U.S. 1st and 9th Armies, this wasn't just another battlefield. It was a nightmare of invisible killers. The Americans called it the land of sudden death. Mines detonated beneath trucks, medics, even tank retrievers. The terrain was soaked with rain and snow, turning every path into a swamp. Movement slowed to a crawl. Combat engineers worked day and night with metal detectors and bayonets, crawling on their stomachs to probe for hidden mines. The Jeep, the light, four-wheel drive Willys MB, had become the heartbeat of the Allied advance. Small enough to slip through forest trails and light enough to cross temporary bridges, it carried ammunition, medics, wounded men, and officers alike. Soldiers called it the faithful mule of war. Its flat fenders served as seats, tables, even makeshift operating surfaces for field surgery. In an army built on logistics, the Jeep was a lifeline. But on the German frontier, that lifeline was constantly at risk. The Wehrmacht had transformed Western Germany into a defensive maze. Entire valleys were mined not just for tanks, but for men and light vehicles. These mines, the dreaded bouncing Bettys, leapt waist-high before detonating, shredding infantry with steel balls. Teller mines lay flat, pressure-sensitive discs that could obliterate a Jeep with a single touch. By December, the weather turned savage. Fog thickened. Temperatures dropped below freezing. Visibility often shrank to a few meters, and both sides moved through a blur of smoke, snow, and fear. Many soldiers confessed later that they couldn't tell where the front line truly was. One wrong turn, and a unit could drive straight into German fire, or worse, into the Earth's hidden explosives. Amid this chaos, the Allied advance depended on courage at the smallest scales. A driver's decision to move forward, an engineer's nerve to disarm a live charge, a medic's will to reach the fallen. In this desperate winter landscape, a single act of bravery could ripple through entire divisions. And that's where the legend of the Jeep in the minefield begins. Not as myth, but as a real moment born of necessity, fear, and the unspoken promise soldiers made to each other, never leave a man behind. The story unfolds along the Western Front, near the Hürtgen Forest, late December 1944, days before the German Ardennes counteroffensive that would erupt into the Battle of the Bulge. The forest, a dark and tangled wilderness of fir and pine, was a place where visibility often shrank to yards, and the air stank of cordite and damp soil. To the U.S. Army's 28th Infantry Division, it was hell disguised as woodland. The Americans had pushed east from Aachen, fighting through fortified ridges toward the Ruhr River. Every hill had been mined. Every open field could hide a charge. German engineers had turned even the approach roads into death traps, burying anti-tank mines just deep enough that rain and snow disguised the disturbed earth. For every yard gained, lives were lost, not to enemy bullets, but to the ground itself. Frontline units learned quickly that minefields were not always marked. Sometimes the Germans left gaps, deliberate, deceptive, safe zones that funneled attackers into crossfire. The only way to clear a path was the hard way: combat engineers with bayonets, probing inch by inch. When the line shifted suddenly or wounded men fell in a mined area, rescue was almost impossible. Orders were often brutal in their honesty. Hold your position. No recovery possible. But soldiers, being soldiers, rarely listened when a friend was bleeding out in front of them. That day, near a shattered farmhouse overlooking a snow-covered slope, a jeep stood idle beside a frozen ditch. Its driver, a corporal from the 121st Infantry Regiment, had been ordered to ferry ammunition to a forward position. He heard the call on the field radio. 2 wounded men down beyond the mine belt, one of them a medic caught in crossfire. The coordinates were close, too close to ignore. The unit's commanding officer hesitated. They'd already lost 3 men in the same patch of snow trying to cross it on foot. The engineers had marked it earlier that week with white tape, but wind and shell fire had torn it apart. Nobody could tell where the mines began or ended. To drive across would be madness. And yet, to leave comrades there felt worse. The jeep's engine sputtered to life. Men shouted for him to stop, but he only tightened his gloves and looked once toward the white field ahead. He knew the risk. Everyone did. But in those days, courage was often an act of silence. No speeches, no orders, just a choice. Nearby, German spotters in camouflaged bunkers noticed movement. Through binoculars, they saw an olive-drab vehicle edging toward their field. They assumed it was a mistake. Maybe the Americans didn't know what lay ahead. But when the jeep didn't stop, confusion spread across their line. Was it a suicide run? A decoy? Or sheer madness? To the Americans watching from behind the ridge, time seemed to freeze. Each tire rotation felt like the pull of a trigger. Every crunch of snow could be the sound of ignition. The driver's hands didn't shake. He had seen too many men die to believe in luck. Only nerve. The field fell silent, except for the hum of the small, stubborn engine. That was how it began. Not as a planned rescue, not as heroism staged for cameras, but as a desperate human decision in the middle of the coldest, cruelest front of the war. And soon it would become a story whispered across foxholes and mess tents. A jeep that dared cross a minefield. And then, against every law of survival, came back again. The human angle. Brotherhood in the frozen line. In war, bravery is rarely loud. It is quiet. The kind of silence that sits heavy in a man's chest before he moves. The corporal behind that jeep's wheel wasn't thinking of medals or history books. He was thinking of faces, the 2 lying out there, motionless on the white field. Men he'd eaten with, cursed the cold with, dug trenches beside. Frontline brotherhood during World War II ran deeper than any official command chain. The U.S. infantry lived and fought in tight-knit squads, 12 men sharing one foxhole, one blanket, one cigarette ration. When one fell, the rest felt it like losing part of their own body. And in the Hurtgen, where the trees splintered under artillery and the wind carried screams across the dark valleys, the bond became almost sacred. That jeep's crossing wasn't defiance. It was instinct. A soldier's reflex to protect his own. And that's what made it extraordinary. An ordinary man, pushed beyond the edge of fear, acting on loyalty stronger than self-preservation. In that frozen forest, courage wasn't about not feeling fear, it was about driving through it. The tactical angle, minefields, the silent enemy. The Germans had perfected the art of invisible warfare. A minefield was not just a weapon. It was a psychological barrier. It slowed entire armies, drained morale, and forced caution where aggression was needed most. By late 1944, German engineers were laying millions of mines, both anti-tank and anti-personnel, across the Western Front. They combined them with barbed wire, booby-trapped corpses, and hidden firing lines, creating zones of pure uncertainty. The average infantryman could identify perhaps a few types. Tellermine 35, a flat, circular anti-tank mine requiring 200 pounds of pressure. S-mine 44, the bouncing Betty, triggered by tripwire or pressure, leaping waist-high before exploding. Schützenmine 42, a small wooden box mine, nearly undetectable by metal detectors. The U.S. Army ES Engineer Combat Battalions were tasked with clearing them, a job both vital and nearly suicidal. Most used metal detectors, but snow and shrapnel made false readings constant. So, many engineers still crawled forward on their stomachs, prodding the earth with bayonets, praying each jab didn't hit steel. That jeep had no such tools. Its driver faced not just one mine, but an entire invisible web designed to destroy tanks. Yet somehow, he threaded through it, using the same logic combat engineers sometimes used. Follow tire marks, avoid disturbed snow, and trust weight distribution. The Jeep's low ground pressure, less than 8 pounds per square inch, sometimes allowed it to glide over mines set to trigger under heavier loads. Luck? Yes. But also a kind of battlefield intuition born from months of surviving the impossible. The leadership angle. Orders and instinct commanders on the Western Front faced brutal choices every hour. Every advance meant casualties. Every hesitation risked encirclement. But perhaps the hardest command was to order men to stay put when a comrade lay dying yards away. Field officers often had to balance tactical logic with moral weight. The U.S. Army's 28th Infantry Division, already decimated from Hurtgen fighting, couldn't afford more losses. By the book, no one was to cross a marked minefield without engineer clearance. That was doctrine. But doctrine rarely survives first contact with human conscience. When that corporal gunned his engine, no officer could stop him. Because deep down, they all understood the unspoken truth of war. Leadership doesn't always come from rank. Sometimes it comes from the man who refuses to let fear dictate his next step, even when that step is onto a minefield. As the jeep rolled out, his platoon leader, a lieutenant barely 23, could only watch. He later recalled in his after-action report, "No order given. He went because he couldn't not go." In that moment, one soldier's defiance became an act of leadership stronger than any command. A statement that, even in the mechanical chaos of war, humanity still held the wheel. Three angles, human, tactical, leadership, all converging on a single act. And yet, the story was only half told. Because on the other side of that snow-covered valley, through a pair of German field glasses, another set of eyes was watching and feeling something unexpected. The enemy perspective. Disbelief. Across the line. On the opposite ridge, behind a low wall of sandbags and camouflaged logs, a group of German infantrymen stood frozen. They had seen plenty of madness on the Western Front, tanks charging into ambushes, men stumbling through artillery fire. But this was different. One jeep, alone, driving directly into a field they had sown with death. The minefield had been laid 2 days earlier by pioneer engineers from the 353rd Infantry Division. They knew its design intimately, alternating anti-tank and anti-personnel mines, hidden under a deceptive layer of clean snow. Even the Germans themselves avoided walking there. And yet, the American jeep moved forward, as if unaware or uncaring. Through binoculars, a German sergeant muttered under his breath, muss verrückt sein. He must be insane. Another younger soldier watched silently, his gloved hand gripping a rifle he didn't raise. There was no target here, no tactic, only awe. As the vehicle crawled forward, no explosion came. The men exchanged nervous glances. Was it a trick? But then they saw the truth. A wounded man in the snow, waving weakly toward the jeep. For a brief moment, the war's brutal logic cracked. No one fired. The Americans watched from one side, the Germans from the other, both witnessing an act that defied the entire reason they were killing each other. One man risking his life for another. In the frozen silence of the Hurtgen, humanity flickered between the gun barrels. The technological angle, the machine that shouldn't have survived. If courage was the soul of that moment, the Willys MB Jeep was its body. Born from necessity and built for endurance, it was the simplest machine on the battlefield, yet often the most reliable. By late 1944, over 350,000 Jeeps had rolled off American assembly lines, each a masterpiece of practicality. It had a 2.2-liter Go Devil engine, a short wheelbase, and a four-wheel drive system that gave it an uncanny ability to traverse mud, snow, and rubble. Weighing just 2,300 pounds, it could cross ground that sank heavier vehicles. It was not armored. It was not armed. It was speed and trust made mechanical. Its low weight gave it one small advantage against certain types of mines. Many German Teller mines required the pressure of a tank tread, roughly 400 pounds per square foot, to trigger. A Jeep's contact pressure was sometimes less than half that. Luck played its part, but design saved lives too. Soldiers often joked that the Jeep could run on air and prayer. It carried generals and privates alike, from Eisenhower himself to the medics of the front line. Its very ordinariness made it extraordinary, a machine so humble it became heroic. On that winter day, it was more than transport. It was defiance on four wheels, a symbol of the American soldier's grit, ingenuity, and sheer refusal to stop moving forward. The moral angle, the thin line between duty and humanity. War demands obedience, but history remembers the moments when obedience gave way to conscience. That Jeep's crossing wasn't in any manual. It broke rules, defied orders, and risked more lives than it saved, at least on paper. Yet, it revealed something deeper about human nature in war. The moral spark that survives even amid destruction. Many veterans of the Hurtgen later spoke of the strange duality of that front, how cruelty and compassion lived side by side. Men would fight savagely one moment, then crawl under fire to carry an enemy soldier out of a burning trench. It wasn't heroism, it was the instinct to remain human. For that corporal, the minefield was not just a physical barrier, it was a moral one. Crossing it was an act of rebellion against the cold arithmetic of war, where lives are measured in tactics and terrain. He wasn't supposed to go, but he did. And by doing so, he reminded everyone watching, American or German, that even in the world's darkest hour, one man's choice could still shine like a flare in the snow. As the jeep disappeared into the white haze with 2 wounded men aboard, both sides returned to their war. But something had shifted. The Germans had seen courage without hatred. The Americans had witnessed the price of loyalty. And the forest, for a moment, had gone completely still, as if the earth itself held its breath. That stillness wouldn't last long, because within hours the war would roar back to life, and the Jeep's return journey through that same field would become the defining heartbeat of the story. The Jeep rolled forward into the open field, its olive-drab body ghost-like against the snow. The sound of its small engine, usually drowned in the chaos of battle, now echoed through the valley like a heartbeat. Every man watching, friend and foe alike, seemed to hold his breath. The corporal's hands were steady on the wheel. He knew the statistics, how many men had vanished in these same fields, how one careless turn could erase him from the earth. But fear, in war, is a constant. You either learn to carry it or be crushed by it. He carried it. The tires left faint tracks over the snow, winding between the dark humps where artillery had churned up the ground. Each patch of disturbed earth could hide a teller mine. He knew it. He could almost feel the pressure plates beneath his tires. He kept the Jeep at a crawl, not too slow to stall, not too fast to lose control. Behind him, the squad crouched low, their helmets just visible above the wall of rubble. No one spoke. One private later recalled, "You could hear the engine change pitch every time the wheels hit a dip, and you'd think, this is it. This is where he disappears." Halfway across, the wind shifted. Snow lifted in thin white veils, obscuring the far end of the field. Visibility dropped to almost nothing. The driver leaned forward, squinting through the mist, steering by memory, by feel. The sound of his own breathing filled his ears, louder than the engine. Then, a click. He froze. It wasn't loud, just the faint metallic tap of rubber brushing steel. For one heartbeat, he waited for the world to end. Nothing. No explosion. He eased off the pedal, heart hammering. The Jeep rolled on, unscathed. Later, engineers would guess the mine had frozen solid, its fuse jammed by ice, a rare, miraculous failure. But at that moment, it was pure providence. Through the haze ahead, a dark figure appeared, one of the wounded. He was lying face up, a bandage soaked crimson around his thigh. The Jeep stopped 10 feet short. The corporal jumped out, boots sinking into the snow with a soft crunch. Every step could have been his last. He knelt, dragged the man's arm over his shoulder, and half-carried, half-dragged him back to the Jeep. Blood streaked the snow behind them like a trail. He laid the soldier gently across the back seat, checked his pulse. Faint, but there. Then another sound, a faint groan. The second man, further out, near the tree line, closer to the German positions. He hesitated only a second before climbing back behind the wheel. The Jeep's engine coughed, sputtered, then roared back to life. He turned the wheel, slowly, deliberately, avoiding his own tracks this time. A wrong move could trigger a mine missed the first time. Behind him, a shell whistled through the fog and exploded somewhere on the far ridge, scattering snow and dirt. German observers couldn't believe what they were seeing. One turned to his sergeant. "He's going again?" The older man didn't answer. He just stared, jaw tight, eyes following that tiny green machine crawling through death itself. The Jeep lurched, its tires slipping on frozen mud. The corporal gunned the throttle, felt the wheels grip, and pushed forward again, toward the second wounded man now slumped beside a crater. Machine gun fire rattled somewhere to the north, echoing through the valley. But none of it was aimed at him. Even the enemy seemed unwilling to interrupt whatever strange human miracle was unfolding. He reached the man, a medic, identified later by the Red Cross armband frozen stiff against his sleeve. The corporal dragged him aboard, crammed him next to the first casualty, and took one last look at the barren white field stretching back toward his unit. 1,000 unseen deaths waiting beneath the snow, and one narrow path home. He gripped the wheel, exhaled once, and pressed down on the accelerator. The Jeep began its return, the most dangerous drive of all. The mines that hadn't triggered on the way in could still explode on the way out. The snow had shifted, hiding his earlier tracks, and now both passengers were unconscious. Dead weight that tilted the balance of the vehicle ever so slightly, enough to change how the tires pressed into the earth. Every yard was a gamble. Every second stretched into eternity. Behind the ridge, American soldiers prayed. Not aloud, just silently, lips moving in the cold. One man gripped his rifle so tightly the skin broke along his palm. Another stared through binoculars, whispering, "Come on, come on." The Jeep vanished behind a curtain of fog. For nearly 30 seconds, the field was silent. No movement, no sound, just a blank wall of fog curling over the snow, as if the world itself was waiting to see whether courage could truly cheat death. Then, faintly, the hum returned. That small, stubborn engine. Alive. The Jeep reappeared like a ghost from the mist. Headlights off, windshield spattered with mud, its driver hunched low over the wheel. On the back seat, 2 wounded men lay motionless, their bodies swaying with every bump. The driver's face was pale, jaw clenched, eyes flicking between his fading tire marks and the far ridge. The road home wasn't a road at all. It was memory, a mental map of where death might not be hiding. The snow had shifted since his first crossing, filling in his tracks. He had no markers now, no guide but instinct and desperation. Behind him, the distant thump of German artillery began again. Random shelling meant to keep the Americans pinned. Each detonation sent vibrations through the frozen ground. Each shock wave could have triggered a mine. He drove through it anyway. At one point, a shell landed so close that a wave of dirt and ice slammed against the Jeep ES side. The vehicle skidded, fishtailed. One tire dipped into a small crater. The engine screamed as he corrected the spin. Another inch, another heartbeat, and they would have vanished in a flash of steel and fire. But somehow, impossibly, the Jeep stayed upright. From the ridge, a German sergeant watched through binoculars, jaw set. He could have ordered machine gun fire, but he didn't. Later, captured prisoners from that same position admitted, "We didn't shoot. It didn't feel right." Even enemies understood the purity of that moment. There was no strategy, no advantage, only a man doing what no sane man would do. And everyone else, too, moved to stop him. The Jeep crawled another 20 yards, then 20 more. Every bump threatened to detonate something beneath. The corporal kept his weight perfectly balanced, hands barely touching the wheel, throttle steady. He'd driven Jeeps since training in England, across mud, bridges, and roads slick with oil. But never like this. This was not driving. This was prayer in motion. Halfway back, the fog broke for a moment, and he saw the silhouettes of his squad ahead, waving, shouting, signaling directions. Their hands pointed right, then left, guiding him through what they thought was the safe line. None of them knew for sure. They just wanted him home. The corporal's arms were trembling now, not from fear, but from strain. He had been gripping the wheel for so long that his knuckles were cracked and raw. His breath came in sharp, controlled bursts, a rhythm that matched the chug of the engine. Slowly, the field began to slope upward toward friendly ground. Then, another sound. Snap. The Jeep jerked to one side. For a terrifying instant, he thought a tire had hit a tripwire. But it was only the strap of a field pack snapping loose. He didn't even look back. He just kept going. Behind him, one of the wounded groaned, a faint human sound cutting through the wind. He was alive. That was enough. As the Jeep neared the final stretch, machine guns rattled somewhere to the north. German suppressive fire aimed at another American platoon. The driver didn't flinch. He could see his comrades now, faces emerging through the snow, one man waving frantically, motioning him toward a narrow corridor marked earlier by engineers. That was the edge of the minefield. 20 more yards. The Jeep crawled forward, wheels crunching softly on packed snow. 10 yards. 5. Then, boom. The explosion wasn't under him. It was off to his left, a secondary mine triggered by the vibration of the passing Jeep. The blast tore a crater in the snow, throwing shards of frozen dirt into the air. The vehicle rocked, but stayed intact. He didn't stop. He didn't even look. He just pushed through, every nerve on fire, until finally, the tires rolled over bare, unmined earth. He was through. The men rushed forward, shouting, pulling the wounded from the back, dragging them behind cover. The Jeep's engine sputtered once, coughed, and died, its gas tank nearly empty. The corporal sat behind the wheel, staring straight ahead, unable to move. One of his squad mates later said, "He looked like he'd aged 10 years in 10 minutes. They got the wounded to the medics. One would lose a leg, the other would survive with scars. The driver refused morphine, refused food. He just sat by the Jeep, head bowed, until his commanding officer approached. No words were spoken. The lieutenant simply placed a hand on his shoulder and said quietly, 'You brought them home.' Behind the ridge, German artillery had gone silent. For the first time that day, the forest was still. Only the smoke of the last explosion drifted lazily across the valley, a reminder of how close death had come. That Jeep, scratched, dented, and dusted white with frost, would be towed back to base the next morning. It would never run again. But for every man who saw it parked there, scarred and silent, it became more than a machine. It became proof that courage could cross even a field of death and come back breathing. And when word spread through the division that night, the men didn't call it luck or madness. They called it something else. Faith. Echoes through the line. By dawn, the fog over the forest had lifted. The minefield lay still, frozen, cratered, scarred by explosions. Among the wreckage, the Jeep's tire tracks were still visible, faint imprints snaking across white earth like scars on skin. Men from the engineering corps marked the path with small flags, each one planted where the tires had touched solid ground. They counted 68 yards. That was the distance between death and survival. When news reached the command post, disbelief spread faster than confirmation. Officers argued it couldn't be true. No one crosses a minefield twice in one piece. Not in the Ardennes, not in that terrain, not in those conditions. But then the medics confirmed it. 2 wounded soldiers were alive because one man had refused to wait for clearance, refused to abandon them in the snow. The corporal's name appeared briefly in the day's operations log, a single line beneath the coded coordinates of the sector. No flourish, no headline, just a note. Driver retrieved casualties through enemy minefield. Vehicle disabled, but personnel safe. That was how history often recorded courage, in language so calm it hid the fire behind it. Still, word spread quietly from foxhole to foxhole, from kitchen tent to outpost bunker. By the time the battalion regrouped at dusk, everyone knew the story. They called it the Jeep Run. Some said it was a miracle. Others said it was suicide, with perfect luck. But for the men who saw it happen, it was proof that the human heart could sometimes defy logic and live to tell about it. Engineers later swept the field and confirmed what no one wanted to believe. Over 40 active mines still lay beneath the surface, where the Jeep had passed. None had detonated. The probability of survival, one officer calculated, was less than 1 in 10,000. The Germans, too, took notice. Intercepted radio chatter that week included an odd line from a German field sergeant near the same sector. One American crossed the minefield in a car. Then he came back. We saw it. We did not shoot. It was not war. It was something else. That strange human moment, the suspension of violence amid chaos, became something soldiers on both sides would remember long after the battle lines shifted. At headquarters, when questioned about the event, the corporal said little. He was exhausted, voice rough from cold. When asked why he did it, his answer was simple. They were still out there. No drama, no speech, just duty. His commanding officer recommended him for the Silver Star, one of the highest U.S. military honors for gallantry. The paperwork went up the chain, though it would take weeks to process. By then, the war was already moving. New fronts, new fires, new dangers. But within his own company, he didn't need a medal. He had something rarer: respect. The kind earned not by rank or rhetoric, but by action. In the following days, engineers cleared the last of the mines and reopened the route. It became an unofficial landmark. Jeep Path, men called it. Some walked it quietly when passing through, as if stepping on sacred ground. A few even left spent shell casings or broken dog tags at the field's edge, small tokens for the ones who hadn't been so lucky elsewhere. Back at the motor pool, the Jeep was set aside. Its body was dented, frame slightly bent, one tire shredded from shrapnel. Mechanics could have fixed it, but they didn't. Instead, they covered it with a tarp, leaving it untouched. It was no longer just a vehicle. It was a relic of defiance. A reminder that sometimes, even in a war built on orders and fear, one man's instinct could change the rhythm of the fight. The corporal himself refused interviews. He spent the next few days in near silence, cleaning his rifle, helping the medics, keeping to himself. His comrades said he looked different afterward, quieter, more distant. Not broken, but changed. As if he'd left something behind in that field that no one else could understand. And yet, every time a supply run went out, or a new Jeep roared through the mud, someone would glance at the empty one near the edge of camp, that silent witness to something impossible, and nod slightly, as if to say, "We remember." But the war didn't stop for memories. New orders were already coming down. The division was to advance again at dawn. And as the men packed their gear and prepared to move, that story, one Jeep, one field, one act of unthinkable courage, traveled with them, carried quietly like a secret between soldiers. Weeks passed. The front lines shifted again, deeper into German territory. Snow turned to slush, slush to mud, and soon the forest where the Jeep had made its run became just another point on a map, replaced by new objectives and new casualties. War had no time for legends. It moved too fast for stories to stay still. But among the men of that company, the memory refused to fade. They carried it from one battlefield to another, a kind of unspoken oath that courage, even when no one is watching, still matters. When replacements arrived, veterans would quietly tell them, "You should have seen what happened back near the line." One Jeep, one driver, a minefield. And though the details changed with each retelling, the feeling never did. It wasn't a boast, it was a warning and a hope. In the months that followed, a reporter from Stars and Stripes, the American military newspaper, caught wind of the incident. He tracked down witnesses, pieced together accounts, and published a short column titled "The Jeep That Wouldn't Stop." It ran on page 3, buried between casualty updates and supply reports. The article never named the driver, only a corporal from the 2nd Armored Division. But that anonymity made the story more powerful. It wasn't about one man's glory. It was about what ordinary men were capable of under extraordinary pressure. Back home, the piece reached a few papers in the States. Mothers and fathers read it over breakfast without knowing whose son it was. Factories paused for a moment as someone recited the story aloud, their voices echoing over the sound of machinery. It was small, fleeting, but it reminded people that amidst the chaos of headlines, humanity still flickered somewhere on those frozen European fields. For the corporal, the attention meant little. By the time the story circulated, he was already in another sector, repairing vehicles and hauling supplies through bombed-out towns. When a fellow soldier showed him the newspaper clipping, he reportedly shrugged and said, "Guess they ran out of real news." Then he folded it, placed it in his jacket pocket, and never spoke of it again. After the war, he returned home to a quiet life, a mechanic in a small Midwestern town. Neighbors would sometimes notice the old Jeep he kept behind his shed, rusting, missing parts, but with a familiar military plate still bolted to the frame. He never restored it. He never sold it. When asked about it, he'd simply reply, "She's done her job." Decades later, when historians compiled accounts of battlefield heroism, the story resurfaced, half forgotten but not lost. Military archives confirmed the incident, and though the exact coordinates were blurred by time, the report remained. Minefield crossing successful. Casualties evacuated. No further loss. No exaggeration, no myth, just fact, cold and clean. But those who truly understood what it meant weren't the historians or the officers who signed the report. It was the men who saw it, who watched that Jeep disappear into the fog and prayed it would never come back, only to see it return through fire and silence. To them, it wasn't just bravery. It was proof that in a war built on orders, sometimes instinct, raw, human, reckless instinct, was what saved lives. Years later, when one of the surviving wounded was interviewed in a veterans' hospital, he was asked what he remembered most about that day. He smiled faintly and said, "The sound of the engine. That's what I remember. It sounded like hope, small but steady." The interviewer paused. He asked if the man ever saw the driver again. The veteran shook his head. "No, but I think about him every winter." In time, the Jeep that crossed the minefield vanished from the records, decommissioned, scrapped, or left behind somewhere on a European farm. No museum holds it. No plaque bears its name. But the story lingers in the oral histories of the war, retold by men who understood that sometimes courage isn't about charging forward. Sometimes It's about turning back when no one expects you to. That quiet defiance, that unshakable sense of duty, became the legacy of a single vehicle and the man who drove it. Not for victory, not for medals, but simply because leaving his brothers behind was unthinkable. As Europe rebuilt and the guns fell silent, that spirit, the one that drove a lone jeep across a minefield and back, lived on in every convoy that followed, every rescue, every moment when fear met resolve. It became part of the DNA of the soldiers who came after, a whisper from the past reminding them what courage looks like when no one is watching. In every war, there are moments that never make it to monuments. Moments too small, too quiet, too human to fit in the language of glory. A single jeep crossing a minefield, twice, is one of them. No generals planned it. No strategy demanded it. It was not part of any operation or grand design. It was instinct. The split-second decision of a man who refused to let the rules of fear decide who lived and who died. History often celebrates victory, but real courage is rarely loud. It lives in the heartbeat between orders, in the silence between explosions, in the simple, stubborn act of doing what must be done, no matter the cost. That jeep was never a weapon. It was an ordinary machine built for utility, not legend. Yet, for one brief moment, it became a symbol of everything that defines the human spirit in war: endurance, loyalty, and the refusal to abandon hope even when surrounded by death. Somewhere in the archives, its story remains a few faded lines on yellowed paper. But to those who understand what it means to fight, to lose, and to keep going, those few lines speak louder than any medal ever could. The war moved on. The world moved on. But the echo of that engine, small, steady, defiant, still drifts through history like a heartbeat that refuses to stop. It reminds us that bravery isn't measured by the size of the battle or the number of witnesses. It's measured by how far one man will go for another. And sometimes, it's the quietest stories. A jeep, a frozen field, and a single act of faith that define what it truly means to be human.